This is a battle that has been deliberately forgotten, its significance and value severely underestimated. It took place 2,000 years ago in Central Asia. It was a pivotal milestone in the 3-century-long war between the Han and the Xiongnu Empires, a perfect testament to the Han dynasty's military might and methods. Its outcome would arguably define the geopolitical landscape of Eurasia for the entire agrarian age. Yet, among all these astonishing features, its most captivating aspect is a single possibility. It might have been the one and only clash between the pinnacle of heavy infantry, the Roman legions, and the army of the Han Empire. Roman legions versus the Han army? How is that even possible? Let us dive into this war and analyze the truth behind this incredible hypothesis.
53 BC was a year of infamy for Rome. In the desert near Carrhae, in modern-day Turkey, one of the Republic's first triumvirate, Marcus Licinius Crassus, a tycoon famous for crushing the Spartacus rebellion, was leading his 7 legions, over 40,000 elite Roman soldiers, into a death trap. This was an unnecessary Eastern campaign, launched by Crassus solely for his own military glory. Now, it had become a catastrophe. A Parthian general with just 10,000 cavalry attacked the Roman force. Though outnumbered 4-1, this Parthian army, composed of 9,000 horse archers and 1,000 cataphracts, employed the famed Parthian shot tactic. With a sky-darkening storm of arrows and fluid mobility, they relentlessly harassed the Roman heavy infantry squares, annihilating their auxiliary forces. When the Romans were finally exhausted by the scorching sun and crippling thirst, the Parthian cataphracts launched a devastating charge. The Roman formations shattered. Of the 40,000 Roman soldiers, 20,000 were killed, 10,000 escaped westward, and 10,000 were captured. Crassus himself was killed during a parley. It was one of the most disastrous military defeats in Roman history. The legionary eagles, symbols of military honor, were seized by the Parthians. Revenge on Parthia became a political rallying cry in Rome for the next century. This semi-nomadic empire, ruled by nomads yet built on the foundations of the Hellenistic Seleucid Empire, would engage in a back-and-forth struggle with Rome for 3 centuries, becoming its primary eastern rival. And the Parthian Empire, in Chinese records, was known as Anxi. Diplomatic relations were established as early as the reign of Emperor Wu of Han. The famous Silk Road was, in essence, a trade route from Han China to Parthia, and from Parthia to Rome. The Parthian Empire firmly controlled the overland trade routes from the Iranian plateau to Mesopotamia. Chinese silk, ironware, and other goods had to pass through the hands of Parthian merchants to reach Rome, their prices inflated several times over. Likewise, Roman glassware, gems, and spices were imported into China via Parthia, which reaped enormous profits from this middleman role. According to records, the eastern border of the Parthian Empire stretched from the Caspian coast of Turkmenistan, southeast along the borders of Afghanistan with Iran and Turkmenistan, and finally south to the vast region west of the Hindu Kush Mountains. On this border, one oasis was particularly important: the Merv Oasis, home to the ancient city of Merv, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. This precious, isolated, fertile oasis stood at a crossroads connecting the Iranian plateau, the mountains of Afghanistan, the Indian subcontinent, and the vast northern steppes.
According to the 1st century Roman writer, naturalist, and military officer Pliny the Elder, in his book Natural History, the Parthian Empire settled the captured Roman legionaries from the Battle of Carrhae in the province of Margiana, and the capital of Margiana was Merv. The contemporary Roman poet Horace, in one of his odes, mocked that. Crassus's soldiers are still alive, shameful husbands to barbarian wives, serving their father-in-law kings. In other words, the surviving Roman legionaries from Carrhae were stationed in Merv, guarding the eastern frontier for the Parthian Empire. This is conclusive evidence of Roman soldiers being present in Central Asia. Indeed, simple logic dictates this. The Parthian-Roman wars lasted for 300 years, and just over a decade after Crassus's defeat, Mark Antony launched another massive campaign against Parthia. It would have been unthinkable for the Parthians to station these unstable elements on their western frontier. The East, Central Asia, was the only possible destination for the lost Roman legion.
But Parthia did not share a border with China. To travel from Merv along the Silk Road, one had to pass through the former lands of the Greco-Bactrian kingdom, trek over 2,500 kilometers, and cross the Pamir Mountains to enter the jurisdiction of the Han dynasty's protectorate of the western regions. A smooth one-way journey would take 4 to 5 months. Between Parthia and the Han's western regions, besides the remnants of the Greco-Bactrian kingdom, there were the Yuezhi and their later Kushan Empire. To the north were the Sogdians of the Kangju kingdom. East of Kangju were the Wusun, allies of the Han, and the Hellenized state of Dayuan, Fergana, conquered by the Han. Further east still lay the protectorate of the western regions of the Han Empire, and the traditional territories of the Xiongnu, and the location of our battle, the fortress of Zhizhi, was deep within Kangju territory in modern-day Kazakhstan, far beyond the reach of the Han protectorate. For an army to march from the Han capital of Chang'an to attack Zhizhi, the straight-line distance would be over 3,000 kilometers. The actual travel distance would likely exceed 5,000 kilometers. And distance was not the main problem. Once a Han army left the plains of central China, it would face a logistical nightmare. Even in the Hexi corridor, firmly under Han control, the army had to rely entirely on a chain of oases for passage and supplies. Leaving the last great oasis, Dunhuang, meant leaving the civilized world and entering the Sea of Death, the Taklamakan, the world's largest shifting sand desert. An army could only advance by hugging the northern or southern rim, relying on scattered, tiny oases. The journey between these oases could take days, sometimes weeks. Hunger, thirst, and lack of supplies were constant threats. Worse, the carrying capacity of these oases was extremely limited. A large army would quickly exhaust their resources, forcing it to carry a massive supply column, which in turn required more personnel, creating a vicious cycle. If, by some miracle, the Han army emerged from the desert without major losses, it would face its next geographical limit, the Pamir Mountains. With an average elevation of over 4,000 meters, the Pamirs remain a formidable barrier between China and Central Asia even today. In the pre-modern era, altitude sickness, extreme temperature swings, and geological disasters were nearly insurmountable obstacles. For an army from Chang'an to cross the Pamirs with even half its forces intact would be a feat of legendary generalship. In fact, during a previous campaign against Dayuan, which was located only on the eastern foothills of the Pamirs, a Han army of tens of thousands was reduced to just a few thousand by the time it returned home.
So, was it simply impossible for a Han army with the technology of the time to enter modern-day Kazakhstan and attack the fortress of Zhizhi? Yes, an attack from the capital of Chang'an would have been a fantastical impossibility. But do not forget, the Han Empire had a unique military-political entity in the West, the Protectorate of the Western Regions, and it had a general who was a singular combination of genius and villainy, Chen Tang.
Let's briefly recount the first half of Chen Tang's life. Unlike the celebrated generals Huo Kubing, Li Guangli, Zhao Chongguo, or even the later Dou Xian, all of whom hailed from powerful aristocratic families or the clans of imperial relatives by marriage, Chen Tang was a dirt-poor commoner. So poor, in fact, that in his youth he often survived by borrowing money and begging, and was frequently shamed by his neighbors for being unable to repay his debts. Yet, from a young age, he was also a diligent and brilliant scholar with an encyclopedic knowledge. He eventually came to the capital, Chang'an, seeking an official post. There, he won the admiration of the Marquis of Fuping, Zhang Bo, who recommended him to the imperial court. But just then, his father died. By law, he was required to return home for a period of mourning. Desperate not to lose this rare opportunity, Chen Tang concealed his father's death. When he was discovered, he was stripped of his post and thrown in prison. He was later released under a general amnesty and, after several twists and turns, was finally appointed as the vice commander of the Protectorate of the Western regions. At this time, the situation in the West had changed dramatically. The Xiongnu, who had been at war with the Han for 150 years, had suffered a series of devastating defeats. The empire had fractured, with as many as 5 chieftains vying for the title of Chanyu, the supreme leader. The final contest was between 2 brothers. The weaker of the two, Zhizhi Chanyu, made a stunning decision in 53 BC. Yes, the very same year Crassus's legions were annihilated at Carrhae. He led his people south, crossed the Great Wall, and personally came to Chang'an to submit to the Han Emperor. He became the first Xiongnu supreme ruler to ever surrender to the Han Empire. His older brother, Zhizhi Chanyu, who had been the stronger contender, was immediately put on the defensive. Hearing that Zhizhi was returning to the northern steppes with the full backing of the Han, Zhizhi was forced to move west, away from his brother's new power base. At this point, the kingdom of Kangju, at war with its neighbors, sought an alliance with the Xiongnu and invited Zhizhi Chanyu and his northern Xiongnu into their territory. The once mighty Xiongnu, though defeated by the Han, were still more than a match for the smaller Central Asian states. Zhizhi quickly carved out a new domain for himself. He then used brutal tactics, including the massacre of several hundred Kangju nobles, to coerce the kingdom into building a fortified city for him near the modern-day Talas River, the fortress of Zhizhi, located in what is today the Gambit region of Kazakhstan. This was a decision that defied all strategic logic. The Xiongnu's great advantage against the Han had always been their strategic mobility as nomads. Han armies could win set-piece battles, but they could never surround, pursue, or finish off the Xiongnu forces, leaving them in a perpetually defensive posture. The few decisive victories the Han had won were the result of incredibly costly, high-risk campaigns led by once-in-a-generation commanders. But now, Zhizhi Chanyu had chosen to build a city, effectively creating a fixed target. Did this make any sense?
In fact, from Zhizhi's perspective, it was a calculated risk. First, his northern Xiongnu were far from home and had suffered heavy losses fighting as mercenaries. They desperately needed a base to rest and regroup. Second, the relative weakness of the Central Asian states had ignited his ambition. He dreamed of using Zhizhi as a pivot to build a new Central Asian empire and revive the glory of the Xiongnu. Third, and most importantly, the location was brilliant. As we mentioned, it was 5,000 kilometers from Chang'an. For perspective, that's like a Roman legion marching from Rome all the way to Western India, beyond even Alexander the Great's conquests, or driving from New York City down to Colombia in South America. In the agrarian age, this was well beyond any feasible military reach. Moreover, to avoid provoking the Han, Zhizhi had deliberately chosen a site that was north of the main Silk Road artery. In short, for the Han Empire, the fortress of Zhizhi on the Talas River was a distant and strategically insignificant target. What Zhizhi Chanyu did not expect, however, was that he would encounter a commoner general whose lust for glory and desperate desire to change his fate bordered on madness.
36 BC, another remarkable year. In Rome, Mark Antony was assembling 10 legions, 60,000 Roman heavy infantry, plus 10,000 Gallic and Spanish cavalry, and over 23,000 auxiliary troops from eastern client states. They would march over 1,600 kilometers to launch a new invasion of Parthia, seeking to avenge the earlier defeat. In that same year, the newly appointed vice commander of the western regions, Chen Tang, learned of Zhizhi's location. Barely able to contain his excitement, he began to persuade his superior, the Protector General Gan Yanshu, to launch an attack. Gan Yanshu's questions were practical. Where would the army come from? And the supplies? Chen Tang's plan was revolutionary. He proposed to mobilize the Han garrison troops already stationed in the western regions for military farming, and then, under the authority of the Protectorate, conscript troops from the various vassal states and allies. This would eliminate the need to wait for an army from the capital and solve the problem of long-distance supply lines. At the time, the Han garrison in the west likely numbered under 20,000 men. Factoring in combat ratios and the need for rear guards, the actual Han expeditionary force would be 10,000 at most. But these were veteran frontier soldiers, highly trained and adapted to the local environment. Their equipment gave them an overwhelming advantage. Full sets of lamellar armor, ring-pommeled swords, halberds, and the uniquely powerful Han crossbow. Each cavalryman had at least 3 horses. According to historical records, one fully equipped Han soldier was worth roughly 10 nomadic warriors. This was, in effect, a special forces unit. The vassal states would provide auxiliary troops, mostly light cavalry and horse archers, and logistical support. The question was, would the emperor approve? Gan Yanshu, the protector general, thought the plan was sound, but he wanted to report it to the court and await permission. Chen Tang, desperate for glory, panicked. A message to Chang'an and back would take half a year. The window of opportunity would be lost. There was only one way: forge an imperial edict. Gan Yanshu must have thought Chen Tang was insane. But while he hesitated, Chen Tang had already, in the emperor's name, conscripted over 40,000 soldiers. He then confronted his superior, sword in hand. "The arrow is already on the bowstring," he declared. "The great army is about to march. Do you intend to stop them with your own strength alone?"
And so, an army of 10,000 elite Han soldiers and 30,000 Western regions auxiliaries marched from the Protectorate headquarters in 2 columns straight for the fortress of Zhizhi. You can imagine a parallel. A US theater commander gets intelligence on the location of a major terrorist leader. Without any authorization, he forges an order, mobilizes Rangers and Delta Force from an overseas base, and, with the help of local allies, invades a nominally neutral third-party country to carry out a decapitation strike. Yes, the Han Empire did that 2,000 years ago, on the authority of a single vice commander and his verbal command.
The historical account of this battle is unusually detailed, violating the classic Chinese historiographical principle of brevity. We can reconstruct the entire 1,000-mile raid based on these records. The Han army advanced in 2 columns, crossing the Pamirs from the north and south. The southern column passed through the vassal state of Dayuan, while the northern column marched through the territory of the Wusun allies, defeating a small Kangju force along the way. The 2 columns then rendezvoused deep within Kangju territory and advanced on Zhizhi with unstoppable momentum. The Han commanders strictly forbade any looting or hostile actions against the Kangju people. Under this combination of might and clemency, many Kangju nobles, who resented the Xiongnu's brutality, defected to the Han, providing intelligence and aid. Hearing of the sudden Han invasion, Zhizhi Chanyu was utterly shocked. His advisors urged him to flee, but he feared that if he left his fortress with only a small retinue, the resentful Kangju would ambush him. He decided to make his stand, hoping to exhaust the supplies of the far-traveled Han army. To this end, he even sent envoys to the approaching Han army to sue for peace, offering to send his own son to Chang'an as a hostage. But no one was going to trust the man who had just executed a Han envoy, least of all Chen Tang, who could taste victory. He replied coldly, "The Son of Heaven has heard you are living in this poor, remote land and fears you are uncomfortable. He has sent us to welcome you and your family back. We have not yet reached your city because we did not want to frighten you." After all attempts at delay had failed, the Han army finally arrived before the fortress of Zhizhi. The records describe a fortification with a double-layered defense system. The outer layer was a stockade made of a double wall of logs, a construction method completely alien to both nomadic and Chinese traditions. The inner layer was a traditional Central Asian earthen wall. On the walls, colorful banners flew, and several hundred armored soldiers stood guard. The Han army made camp by the Talas River, 3 miles from the fortress. 100 Xiongnu cavalry rode out from the gate, galloping back and forth in a show of force. Then the key detail appears. The records state that another 100 or so infantrymen emerged from the gate, formed up in a fish-scale formation, Yulin Zhen, on both sides of the gate, and began to conduct military drills. This was completely outside the nomadic way of war. Nomads did not have heavy infantry, they did not use the fish-scale formation, and most importantly, this kind of disciplined, provocative pre-battle drill was highly uncharacteristic of them. This is the piece of evidence that the American sinologist Homer H. Dubs focused on. He argued that it proved there was a small contingent of Roman legionaries, likely mercenaries, among the Xiongnu forces, and they were practicing their familiar testudo, or tortoise formation. But the truth was, facing the overwhelming numbers of the Han army, it didn't matter if they were Roman legionaries or not. Chen Tang ordered his crossbowmen to unleash a volley. The 100 or so infantry and cavalry immediately retreated back into the city. Then, to the deafening roar of war drums, the Han army launched an all-out assault from every direction. The Han garrison troops, protected by massive shields, advanced in the front, followed by crossbowmen who rained down bolts on the defenders. The auxiliary troops were tasked with filling the moat and blockading the gate. Under the sky-darkening storm of arrows, the defenders on the earthen wall were quickly wiped out. The Han army then brought up firewood and set the wooden stockade ablaze. At night, the desperate Xiongnu, with nowhere left to run, mounted a counterattack. They attempted a cavalry charge out of the city gates, only to be utterly annihilated by the waiting Han forces, who cut them down with a storm of crossbow bolts. Zhizhi Chanyu himself, clad in armor, fought on the wall alongside his dozens of wives and concubines, who were also armed. He was eventually wounded in the face by an arrow, and most of his consorts were killed. He was forced to retreat. By midnight, the outer wooden wall was completely consumed by fire. A relief force of 10,000 Kangju cavalry arrived and launched several charges against the Han lines, but the unarmored light cavalry were merely moving targets for the powerful Han crossbows. After suffering heavy casualties, they abandoned the Xiongnu and fled. At dawn, the Han army, to the sound of thunderous drums, launched its final assault. The Han soldiers swarmed over the earthen walls. The Xiongnu fell back, fighting from street to street. Zhizhi Chanyu retreated into his palace, but the Han soldiers pursued him. In the fierce close quarters fighting that followed, Zhizhi Chanyu was mortally wounded and beheaded. He became the first and only Xiongnu supreme ruler to be killed in battle by the Han. The Battle of Zhizhi was over in a day and a half.
The battle resulted in the deaths of 1,518 Xiongnu, with 145 captured alive and over 1,000 surrendering. These insignificant captives were reportedly divided among the 15 allied vassal states. But it is those 145 men captured alive that have sparked a historical debate. Some historians believe these were the Roman mercenary legionaries. They argue that these men were brought back to Han China and settled in a place in Gansu province called Liqian, the Han name for the Seleucid Empire. It is claimed that these Romans settled in Liqian for 2,000 years, leaving behind tombs with unusually large skeletons, and that the current inhabitants of the village still have European features. However, recent DNA tests on the people of Liqian have debunked this theory. While they do have Central Asian ancestry, they are not genetically distinct from other Chinese populations. No specific Roman genetic markers have been found. In my view, the entire Roman village theory is a red herring. Western sinologists often have difficulty grasping the sheer brutality of ancient Chinese history. The cycles of natural disasters, wars, and dynastic changes repeatedly decimated the population, sometimes by as much as 80 or 90%. A village that could maintain a distinct lineage for 2,000 years is a virtual impossibility in Chinese history, the very reason the mythical Peach Blossom Spring, a village isolated from the world for centuries, is so cherished in Chinese culture is precisely because such a thing is so impossible. Even if Roman captives were once settled in China, their bloodline would have been diluted and lost over 2,000 years of turmoil. Even if we look at the battle itself, it took place 17 years after Carrhae. The Romans at Zhizhi would have been either aging veterans or a new generation trained in their methods. Proving their identity is likely impossible and perhaps unnecessary.
So the question we should be asking is this: did a lost Roman legion, or their descendants, fight the Han Empire in Central Asia? And in the end, everyone has their own answer. But my conclusion is this: while it cannot be proven with 100% certainty, the sheer number of bizarre coincidences creates a near 100% possibility. It may not have truly happened, but it is 100% possible that it could have. Two great events in 53 BC, the defeat of Crassus and the splitting of the Xiongnu, sent the defeated Romans east and the pursuing Han west on a collision course. Two great events in 36 BC, the campaign of Mark Antony and the Battle of Zhizhi, made that collision possible. And I want to add one final astonishing coincidence. Without Chen Tang's forged imperial edict, without his unauthorized glory-seeking personal campaign, there would have been no Han army at Zhizhi. And Crassus's campaign against Parthia was also unauthorized by the Senate, also a mad gamble for personal glory and wealth. And that, in the very beginning, is what made the appearance of Roman legionaries, or their descendants, at the fortress of Zhizhi fundamentally possible. Let's set aside the hypothesis and analyze the raid for what it was. The Battle of Zhizhi was, in reality, a crushing victory for the Han dynasty at the zenith of its power. The fact that Chen Tang, a mere vice commander, could mobilize a 40,000-strong army and launch a decapitation strike deep into Central Asia was a testament to the immense influence the Han Empire had built in the region over the 24 years since the establishment of the Protectorate of the Western regions in 60 BC. According to historical records, the Han court had issued a total of 376 official seals to the leaders of the 48 city-states and small kingdoms of the Western regions, granting titles from city governors and kings all the way down to military commanders and chiefs. Their leaders accepted the direct authority of the Han. This was the political foundation upon which the Battle of Zhizhi was built. From a military perspective, the Han had developed a highly mature system of ranged firepower centered on the Han crossbow, making their formations nearly invincible in positional warfare in the Eastern world. Neither light cavalry nor horse archers could gain any advantage against a deployed Han army. Historical records are filled with successful examples of Han forces, though heavily outnumbered, forming defensive squares to repel Xiongnu cavalry charges. It was a fact. As long as their ammunition held and their supply lines were secure, nomadic armies stood almost no chance in a direct confrontation with empires like Han and Rome. In fact, in that very same year, during Mark Antony's Parthian campaign, the Roman legions also advanced with devastating force, reaching their target city and laying siege. But the overconfident Antony neglected to protect his supply lines. The Parthians dispatched 40,000 cavalry to strike the Roman rear, completely destroying all of their siege equipment. With the siege now hopeless, Antony was forced to retreat, and the Parthians, through harassment, pursuit, and ambushes, inflicted even greater losses on the withdrawing army. In terms of diplomatic and political impact, the fate of Zhizhi Chanyu dramatically reshaped the landscape of Central Asia. Xiongnu Chanyu became the sole, legitimate ruler of the Xiongnu, and his loyalty to the Han remained steadfast throughout his reign. The Wuzun, already allies, became even more dependent on the Han, and the Kangju kingdom, once outside the Han's orbit, began to send envoys and seek friendly relations. After the Battle of Zhizhi, for nearly 40 years it was, as a later age would say, all quiet on the Western Front. Finally, let's look at the personal fates of the characters in our story. Crassus was killed during a parley with the Parthians. Antony's story is well known. He was ultimately defeated by Octavian and committed suicide alongside Cleopatra. And what of Chen Tang? The vice commander who forged an imperial edict to win the Battle of Zhizhi had a turbulent career upon his return. On one hand, his victory was recognized by the emperor, who granted him a noble title. On the other, the scholar officials, led by the Confucians, relentlessly attacked his personal corruption and his audacious defiance of the system. They pressured the emperor to reduce his reward to a non-hereditary title and a minor military post. At the height of his fame, Chen Tang recommended a young man to the court, Wang Mang. In theory, it was impossible for Chen Tang, a man of common birth, to have known the young nephew of the empress. So we have every reason to believe that Chen Tang was either trying to curry favor with the powerful Wang clan that controlled the court, or he had been handsomely paid to do so. Later, Chen Tang's greed and ambition led him to make another mistake. The scholar officials opened fire with all cannons, and he was eventually stripped of his post and thrown in prison. At the critical moment, it was his extraordinary military talent that saved him. The succeeding emperor, valuing his skills, had him reinstated. Chen Tang's career rose and fell several more times. He was even exiled to the frontier, to the very fortress of the Jade Gate. The local officials there pleaded on his behalf in a roundabout way. Chen Tang's name is legendary. All the kingdoms of the West revere him. To station him here, so close to them, is a blow to our international prestige. Please send him back to the interior. The emperor, finally recalling Chen Tang's contributions, allowed the hero of Zhizhi to return to the capital. A few years later, Chen Tang died of illness, still without any official title or rank, as poor as he had begun. Several years after that, the young man he had once recommended, Wang Mang, became the Grand Marshal, the sole power at court, and began his inexorable march toward the throne. He broke the 40-year peace and reignited the war with the Xiongnu. And to build a public narrative that suited his own military and diplomatic ambitions, he reached back for a useful symbol, the hero who had first introduced him to the court. He posthumously granted the long-dead Chen Tang a glorious title and made his son a full hereditary marquis.
In his report to the emperor, Chen Tang wrote a line that would echo through history. "Let those who dare challenge the great Han be hunted down, no matter how far they run." It was his own clear-eyed interpretation of the political significance of his campaign, but it was too sharp, too aggressive, and completely at odds with the increasingly defensive foreign policy of later Chinese dynasties. And so, with very few exceptions, it was almost never promoted by the ruling class. Even in China today, this sentence mostly lies dormant, a quiet line in a history book. But online, a new generation has begun to champion this phrase. They have begun to retell the story of Chen Tang. Why? This is where history is at its most helpless, and yet at its most fascinating. It has so many possibilities, so many sides. The history we read often depends on the angle from which we approach it. It depends on what we are looking for.